I still see them. Every night, without fail, I see them. It's a constant, it's haunting, it's terrifying, yet no one believes me. It started back at the tunnel that we discovered on a day out with friends. A day out like every other, when we'd go for a walk over the moorland close to our houses in North Yorkshire, England. This day started like every other. The air was clean and cold, the sky was pale, the wind had that steady bite that makes you zip your jacket without thinking, and the trail was familiar enough that we could have walked it half asleep, cutting across the higher ground and following the worn path that everyone in the area knows. We'd done that walk before, plenty of times. We never usually went off the trail because there wasn't much reason to. It was just heather, grass, uneven dips in the ground, and that wide open quiet you only really notice when you stop talking. But this day was different. We stood there for a second and looked out at a clearing that seemed to be about a mile away. A stretch of land that looked slightly lower and lighter than the rest. And without even calling it a decision, we started walking straight toward it, boots pressing into the soft patches of earth, stepping over rough grass, and the path disappeared behind us. It didn't feel reckless in the moment. It felt like we were doing something new in a place we thought we already understood. That was when we discovered the tunnel. It didn't look dramatic in daylight, not at first glance. It was just there, cutting into the hillside, an opening built from earth and peat with grass drooping over the top edge. The kind of thing you might mistake for an old, collapsed entrance to a mine if you weren't standing right in front of it. But the closer we got, the more it started to feel wrong. The mouth was bigger than it should have been, tall enough for a person to walk into without ducking, and the inside was angled just enough that you could see a stretch of darkness pulling inward without seeing where it ended. It looked similar to a mine shaft, but without the rock walls or wooden supports you expect. Just packed dirt, damp soil, and a shadow that felt heavy even in the middle of day. We were interested, something different, and we were all excited to see it. We stood there, talking over each other, saying it was probably nothing, saying we'd never noticed it before, saying we should look inside while we had the chance, and in the daytime, it still looked normal enough to trick you into thinking it was safe, so we walked in. We didn't go in very far that first time. It was still daylight, the same kind of typical flat afternoon light that makes everything look miserable, and we were still in that easy mood where you're talking over each other and pushing your way to the front to see who can spot the most interesting detail. The air inside was cooler and damp. The smell was soil and old wet earth, and the floor felt packed down like it had been walked on before, but there was nothing that looked obviously dangerous if you only judged it by what your eyes could grab in the first few steps. The tunnel seemed to keep going, narrowing slightly, stretching into the hillside in a straight pull of darkness that was hard to measure because we didn't have the patience to test it. We shone our phone lights around, laughed at how our voices changed in there, and then we backed out, still talking, still moving like it was just another thing we'd stumbled on during a walk. We carried on across the moor and eventually looped our way back towards home. The tunnel already shrinking in the background of the day as it was waiting to be remembered later. That night, I went to bed, thinking nothing of it, head still warm with the feeling of a decent day out, the kind you don't write down because you expect there will be hundreds and hundreds more just like it. A few hours into the night, I woke up to a noise that didn't belong in my house. At first, it was just a slow scrape that sounded too deliberate to be wind or pipes. Then a second sound joined it, softer, almost like a foot shifting on dirt, and my body reacted before my mind could build an excuse. I sat up, cold all over, and it was like my feet were already moving while the rest of me was still trying to understand what I was doing. I can't explain that part in a neat way. I didn't decide to go back. I didn't plan it. I was terrified of the idea, but I was also standing up, pulling on clothes, unlocking the front door and stepping into the night like something had taken hold of the simplest parts of me that know how to walk and breathe. The moorland at night was darker than I'd ever seen it. The sky sharp with stars, the trail almost invisible, and I kept stopping because I wanted the spell to break. But every time I stopped, the scraping seemed to start again in my head, and the only way to calm it was to keep moving toward the place it had started. When the tunnel came into view, the entrance looked bigger than it had in daylight, and the darkness inside looked deeper, as if the hill had opened its mouth again and hadn't closed it in the hours since we left. Then I saw the light. A faint flicker far inside, right at what felt like the end of the tunnel. Warm and small and steady enough to make me believe it was real, even though nothing about the situation should have allowed it. I remember shaking so hard I could hear my teeth click, and I remember thinking I was about to turn around and run, but my legs pushed me forward. The fear wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the feeling that my fear didn't matter. I walked in until the flicker grew clearer, until the air felt colder with each step, until the sound I'd heard in my house returned. Not behind me this time, but all around me, like the tunnel itself was making room just for it. I reached the source of the light and realized it wasn't the main tunnel at all. There was a smaller opening off to one side, a tighter side passage carved into the earth like a second throat, and the flicker was just sitting inside that narrower darkness. That was when I saw them. 3 figures, not solid like people, not glowing like a cheap effect, but thin and wrong, faintly transparent in a way that made the darkness behind them look warped, as if the air was colder where their shapes stood. They were spaced apart, watching, and the temperature dropped so fast my breath felt trapped in my chest. I didn't think. I didn't choose anything. My body snapped into panic and I turned and ran, screaming without realizing I was screaming, sprinting back toward the entrance, my foot catching on uneven ground. I went down hard, dirt in my mouth, and when I looked back, they were closer, moving with a calm that made them even more terrifying. They didn't need to hurry. The cold rolled over me like a wave, and for a second I couldn't move at all. Then, whatever hold they had on me loosened just enough for pure survival to take over. I got up and ran until my lungs burned and the stars blurred and my heart felt like it was trying to escape my ribs. I made it home and fell onto my bed without even taking my shoes off, and I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember waking again a few hours later to the same noises and the certainty that those 3 figures were somewhere close. Not in the way you imagine in a nightmare, but in the way you sense a presence standing just out of sight. The next day, I told my friends, and they laughed at first. Not cruelly, more like they were trying to push the fear back into a shape that made sense, and they said we should go back and prove it was nothing. We went in the evening. Not fully dark yet, but late enough that shadows were stretching, and I kept saying it happens at night. That's when it changes. That's when the light comes, and they looked at me like I was losing it. Inside the tunnel, they saw nothing but dirt and darkness. I saw the flicker again, faint and distant, and I saw the three shapes standing where the side passage cut away. And when I started shouting for my friends to look, to really look, their faces changed. Not into belief, but into that uncomfortable worry people get when they think someone is breaking in front of them. And the worst part was realizing that to them, I didn't look haunted by the tunnel. I looked haunted by my own mind while I was standing there watching the same light that had dragged me out of bed the night before. I didn't calm down after that evening trip. If anything, it made it worse, because the tunnel had split my life clean into two versions of reality. The version my friends could stand inside and measure with their eyes, and the version that only opened for me when the light thinned and the air cooled and the world started to feel slightly misaligned. They kept looking at me like they were trying to decide whether I was faking it or breaking, and I could see the exact moment my fear became a problem they wanted to solve instead of something they wanted to understand. We walked back across the moor as the sky darkened, and I kept turning my head to check the mouth of that place, even when it was already out of sight. I couldn't shake the idea that it wasn't a location anymore. It was a presence that had learned how to live in the back of my own eyes. When I got home that night, the flicker was already in my head like an afterimage, and the noises started before midnight. 3 distinct sounds that never overlapped, as if someone was testing a pattern the way you test a lock. A scrape, a shout, and a soft foot shuffle that stopped the moment I held my breath. A tapping that sounded like it was coming from inside the wall rather than against it. I tried to record it on my phone, but every time I hit record, the house fell quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like silence was another part of the pattern. When I checked the screen later, the audio was there but thin, almost drowned out by a low hiss that wasn't present to my ears. The next morning, I watched the clip again in daylight, and the hiss sounded like a breath held too long. I deleted it because I couldn't stand the thought of carrying it around. Over the next few days, I started losing whole chunks of time. I'd be sitting somewhere, staring at nothing, and the next thing I knew, the room had changed around me and someone was asking me if I was okay. And I would look down and realize my hands were still clenched, nails pressed into my palms hard enough to leave marks. I stopped answering messages quickly, not on purpose, but because my brain kept drifting back to the tunnel in short, violent flashes. The mouth of it in daylight, the same mouth at night, the side passage where the 3 shapes stood, the flickering light that looked like a single weak flame in a place that should have been empty. One afternoon, I walked home alone and caught my reflection in a shop window, and just behind my shoulder were 3 darker shapes that weren't matching the angle of the street or the moving cars. I spun around so fast, I nearly fell. There was nothing there. When I looked back at the glass, the shapes were gone, but the cold stayed in my chest for hours. That night, the flicker came back in my room. Not bright, not dramatic, just a faint warm pulse reflected in the corner of my phone screen when the phone wasn't even on. I knew I should tell someone, but the thought of trying to explain it made me feel sick. How do you say you keep seeing 3 figures that your friends can't see, and that the only thing that makes the feeling thinner is walking toward an earthen hole in the hills? 2 days later, I woke at 3 a.m, standing in my own hallway. I don't mean I woke and decided to walk out there. I mean, I came to awareness mid-step, like some part of me had been running a program without permission, and I was already moving toward the front door with my keys in my hand. I can still feel that moment. The terror of realizing my body could move while my mind screamed no. I locked the door and slid down against it, sweating in the dark, and then the tapping started again. 3 sets. Slow, controlled, not on the front door, but on the wall beside it, as if the sound was reminding me that it didn't need entrances. The next morning I told Paul I was done, that I wasn't going back out there, that something about the tunnel had its hands inside my head, and he tried to laugh it off, but failed. That afternoon he messaged me, saying he'd woken up at night with muddy footprints by his bed that weren't his. Jake sent a photo of his backyard gate, open, with fresh earth smeared along the latch like someone had gripped it with dirty hands. Adam didn't message at all. Then he finally sent one sentence at nearly midnight, just a sentence that made my stomach drop. He wrote, "I heard you screaming last night, and I couldn't see anyone there." That was when I understood the tunnel wasn't satisfied with just me being afraid. It was turning my fear into a shared pressure, not enough for them to see what I saw, but enough for them to feel the edges of it. We tried to get ahead of it by going back again, this time properly at night with all 4 of us, and I hated that we chose to do that. But the kind of fear that humiliates you in front of your friends can push you into decisions you wouldn't make alone. We met late when the moor was black and the stars were sharp, and we walked the trail faster than we should have because the silence was too heavy to carry slowly. The entrance was exactly where it had always been, earth and peat, grass drooping over the lip, and I heard my own breath come too fast before we even stepped inside. They turned on phone lights and saw only dirt walls and a long dark pool, but I saw the flicker instantly, faint and far, like it had been waiting out the evening just for me. I said it was there. They said they couldn't see it. I stepped forward, and my legs felt light and wrong, like I was walking with less control than I should have had. And the scrape started behind us again, slow and patient. Paul swung his light back and saw nothing. I saw the shadow of 3 shapes appear briefly as the flicker pulsed, and I started shouting because I couldn't keep it contained anymore. I kept saying, "They're right there, they're right there," and my voice sounded like someone else's voice, lower and rougher, like fear had scraped part of me away. Jake grabbed my arm and told me to calm down, and in that moment I realized the worst part of the haunting wasn't the figures themselves. It was being watched, collapsing into someone my friends didn't recognize. I jerked away from him and stepped into the side passage without deciding to, drawn towards the light like a command, and the 3 figures were there, clearer than they'd ever been. Their shapes thin and translucent, edges faintly shifting as they were formed out of colder air. The temperature dropped. So fast my throat tightened and my eyes watered from the shock of it, and I heard Paul shouting my name behind me, but the sound was muffled, like the tunnel was swallowing every voice except mine. I didn't know how long I stood there, because time in that narrow opening felt stretched and thick, but I remember the light changing. It stopped flickering for a second and steadied into something almost calm, and that calm was worse than any sudden scare because it felt like a decision had been made. The 3 figures didn't rush me. They didn't need to. They simply moved forward in a slow, synchronized glide that felt more like pressure than movement, and I couldn't move my legs at all. I could move my eyes. I could move my mouth. I couldn't move my body. The cold rolled over me hard enough that my skin prickled and my hands went numb, and the light drifted closer until it was right between us. Not a lamp, not a flare, something that looked like a flame but didn't behave like one, because it didn't cast a normal shadow. It cast a distortion, a faint bending of darkness that made the earth walls look deeper than they should have been. Then I screamed, not because I planned to, but because my body finally broke the freeze the way an animal breaks a trap, and I stumbled backwards into the main tunnel and nearly collided with Paul. The three of them had seen me vanish into that side passage, and they had heard me shouting, but they hadn't seen what I saw, even with their lights aimed straight at me. I remember Adam's face, not scared in the way I was scared, more baffled and unsettled because he was watching something he couldn't name happening to someone he knew. We ran out together, all four of us tripping over each other, and when we reached the mouth of the tunnel I turned back and saw the three figures standing just inside the shadows as if they couldn't step out past the grass lip, as if there was a boundary they were obeying. That gave me a thin, sick hope that rules existed, that logic could still be found. The hope lasted less than an hour. A week later, an older guy I recognized from the area stopped me outside a shop after he overheard my friends joking about the tunnel. He didn't joke. He asked me quietly if we'd gone inside. When I said yes, his face changed in a way I will never forget. He told me that years ago, 3 teenagers went missing out on the moor after messing around near an old earth cut that people argued about whether it was a collapsed mine entrance or something a lot older. They were never found. No bodies, no bags, no clear story. Just 3 names that stopped being said out loud after a while. He didn't spin a legend. He didn't tell me a ghost tale. He just said, almost under his breath, that some places don't take one person, they take a set. And that if a place has taken 3 before, you don't give it a reason to start counting again. I walked away shaking because he said the number without me telling him the number. That night, I searched for local posts and old news mentions and found a blurred thread with 3 photos and 3 families begging for information. My heart started beating so hard, my hands went numb. The faces were young and ordinary, the kind of guys you'd pass on the street, and the last comment on the thread was a single line from someone who claimed to have walked past a tunnel years later and seen 3 silhouettes inside the mouth at dusk. All I could do was freeze and shut my laptop, hoping that this wasn't true. The next time the flicker returned in my room, I didn't even pretend it was a dream. It appeared low near the floor, faint and warm, and the temperature in the room dropped in steps, not all at once, like the cold was arriving in 3 waves. The scrape started in the hallway, then the soft footfall, then the tapping, and I realized with absolute clarity that the tunnel had never been limited to the moor. The tunnel was a doorway, the light a signal. The 3 figures were not random spirits drifting through my life. They were a chain. They were the last 3, and they were showing me what comes next. I tried to shout for help and my voice came out thin. I switched on my light and the flicker vanished, but the sense of being watched didn't. When I turned my head toward the wardrobe, I saw 3 faint, vertical impressions on the door, like marks left by cold hands that weren't fully solid, and that was the moment my fear hit a new level of insanity. The haunting was no longer just visual and auditory. It was leaving traces that still wouldn't convince anyone who needed a good explanation. I called my friends the next day and told them we had to stop going near that place. They told me I was spiraling again. Adam said the older guy's story could be coincidence. Jake finally spoke and said he'd been having the same nightmares of the tunnel mouth widening like it was breathing. I didn't want to hear logic anymore. Logic had failed the second 3 figures stood in front of me under my friend's light, and only I could see them. The night after that, I woke up outside, not in my hallway, outside my house, shoes on, keys in my pocket, the cold cutting through my jacket. My phone showed a time that didn't fit the gaps in my memory. I was halfway down the street before I came back fully to myself, and I knew where my legs were trying to take me. The tunnel, the moor, the light. I turned and ran home and locked myself in the bathroom, sitting on the floor with my back against the door like that would hold the world in place. I stayed there until morning. The end of this part of the story is the part I wish I could write clearly, but it wasn't clean. It was panic and exhaustion and a decision made out of desperation. We went back one last time. Not because we wanted to prove anything, but because I needed to know if I was marked alone or if the tunnel had marked all of us and was using me as the first crack. We stood at the entrance under a sky that looked too calm for what was happening on the ground, and I said the simplest truth I could say without begging. I told them I'd seen 3 figures since the day we found the place, and that the light was never a normal light, and that I was starting to wake up, walking toward it without controlling my body. Adam looked at me like he wanted to argue. Paul looked tired, and Jake looked pale. We stepped inside, only a short distance, and waited. Nothing moved, nothing scraped, nothing tapped. Then the flicker appeared, faint and far, and I was the only one who reacted to it. I felt my legs lighten again, that awful sense of being guided, and I forced myself to step back instead of forward. The cold hit immediately, sharp enough to steal breath, and the 3 figures materialized in the side opening with a clarity that nearly dropped me to my knees. My friends saw me stiffen, saw my face change, saw my mouth go slack with terror, and they still saw nothing ahead of my eyes. That was the final cruelty. The proof they needed was the one thing the tunnel refused to give them. We ran out again, all 4 of us, but this time I understood something that made the fear deeper rather than easier. The figures didn't need my friends to believe. They were not here to win an argument. They were here to complete a pattern that had started before we even knew the tunnel existed. The last time I saw them, that week, was not on the moor. It was in my room. Close enough that the cold felt like a hand pressed against the base of my throat, and for the first time I saw something that looked like recognition in the way they held their distance. Not pity, not anger, recognition. Like I was standing in a place another person had stood before. Like the tunnel had taught them their job. The noises stopped after that for 2 whole nights, which should have been a relief, but the silence felt staged. On the 3rd night, the flicker returned, steady for longer than it had ever been, and I knew what the older guy meant about places that count. I don't have a clean, heroic ending to give you. What I have is the truth as I'm living it. I'm still here because I stopped going near that tunnel, because I finally had to accept that whatever rules it was working by, it was using distance and exhaustion and doubt as weapons, and because I understood that the light was never inviting me to discover anything, it was testing how long it would take me to surrender. The tunnel is still out there. The moorland is still quiet in daylight. People still walk those hills. My friends still argue about what they think I saw, but I still see them. Every night, without fail, I still see them. And the last thing I saw before I started writing this down was the faint light reflected in the dark glass of my bedroom window, and 3 shapes behind my own reflection, spaced apart, waiting like they have all the time in the world.